The Life Sciences DNA podcast is sponsored by Agilicium Labs, a collaborative space where Agilicium works with its clients to co-develop and incubate POCs, products, and solutions. To learn how Agilicium Labs can use the power of its generative AI for life sciences analytics, visit them at labs.agilicium.com. Amar, we've got Aaron Cohen on the show today. Who's Aaron?
Dr. Aaron Cohen is head of research oncology clinical data for Flatiron Health.
And what is Flatiron Health?
Flatiron Health is a health tech company focused on transforming cancer care and research through technology and data science. The company collects and analyzes real-world clinical data from electronic health records across a network of oncology practices and academic cancer centers. And it offers products and services to support researchers, providers, and biopharma companies with clinical trials, drug development, and care optimization. Their curated data sets help accelerate research and support clinical decision-making.
And what are you hoping to hear from Aaron today?
Flatiron recently did a study on the use of large language models to extract and analyze clinical details from unstructured data in electronic health records. So I want to talk to them about the study, but also about where we are in terms of using AI to do this kind of work. And then the challenges, of course, that we're facing doing that, and how it's going to better enable the use and access to real-world data, and of course, how it's going to help us improve everything from, let's say, patient selection for clinical trials to outcomes for patients in real-world settings.
Before we begin, I just want to remind our audience that they can stay up on the latest episodes of Life Sciences DNA by hitting the subscribe button. If you enjoy the content, be sure to hit the like button and let us know your thoughts in the comments section. And don't forget to listen to the podcast on the go by downloading an audio-only version of the show from your preferred podcast platform. With that, let's welcome Aaron to the show.
Aaron, thanks for joining us. We're going to talk today about how Flatiron Health has used large language models to extract clinical data from unstructured electronic health records, or EHRs, and the potential this technology has for changing cancer drug development and patient care. Let's start with Flatiron Health. Can you tell us a bit more about Flatiron Health?
Yeah, happy to. And thanks for having me on. I'm really excited for the discussion. So Flatiron Health is an oncology-specific health tech company. We own an electronic health record called OncoEMR. It's widely used across the country by mostly community oncologists. And through our business service agreements with them, and we get access to de-identified patient data that gives us a sense of how patients in the real world are doing with their cancer care. And that over the last 10 years has proven to actually be very insightful and valuable in better understanding how patients are doing, as opposed to, say, on a clinical trial where patients tend to be younger, healthier, higher socioeconomic status. That's not always the case in the real world. And so, like, for example, when I'm seeing a patient, one of the first things I have to do is think, okay, this is the drug I want to give the patient. This is the study that the drug was approved on. How similar is this patient to the patients that were on the study or not? Would the patient have met criteria, not met criteria? And that's a challenging thing for a physician to need to do. And so with some of the things that Flatiron does, with, I would say, advances in real world evidence and understanding how valuable it could be, that's starting to be able to answer some of those questions.
Mm-hmm. And when you talk about EHRs or EMRs, the electronic health records, what type of data do we find in those usually that you can do research on?
There's a lot of different types of data, I would say. I think for the purposes of this conversation, it's helpful to distinguish between structured data and unstructured data. Structured data, mostly I think of as things when I'm using the EHR point and click, and readily usable, analyzable. Unstructured data, pretty much everything else. And so if you've been at a physician's visit recently and ever seen them hopefully making eye contact, but if not, staring at the computer, typing. All that's free text, all that's unstructured, and that is the details of the visit and how the patient's doing. But all of that is unstructured and not readily usable. And so there's clinical notes with that sort of free text. There's PDFs of biomarker reports, like molecular testing, biopsy reports, staging information. There's communications, with social work. So there's really all sorts of different types of things in there, and really figuring out how to sift through all that and make use of it is harder than it sounds.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, but then the structured data, which is the tabular data, which is like, you can capture a lot of, let's say, their vitals or a lot of the other measurements, and those are in a table format, and those are much easier to analyze, right? Whereas the notes are much, much more hard to analyze and get the right insights from them.
Correct. Yes. You know, when I was training, I didn't put a lot of thought into how I entered data into the EHR. Most know that EHRs were primarily exist for billing purposes and to justify why you're making a certain decision. And when you're training, you kind of learn what your process and workflow is going to be for having a visit and documenting it, right? And I would say one of the main things I paid attention to were ICD codes because it was important for billing. And ICD codes are a structured data point that give you information about a patient's diagnosis or a problem, right? But that's one of the, I would say, few structured data points that is readily available in the EHR that actually gives you some idea of what's going on with a person's cancer. And there's a lot of different components of cancer care and how a patient experiences cancer. And that ranges from, when the patient's initially diagnosed and what the imaging says and the biopsy results. Maybe they have molecular testing on it. All of those things, not structured. They're all in those PDF reports I referenced earlier. They're all, maybe I had the resource elsewhere and I'm just transcribing it into the EHR. So certainly in my new role, it's been interesting to understand the value of being able to put data into the EHR in a more usable format from the get-go. But even still, just how it's set up really currently lends itself to, typing and just unstructured data entry.
Okay. And as you mentioned, right, EHRs were designed for insurance, billing purpose, and not for research. So as you use this information for research purpose, what are some of the challenges that you have to deal with?
There are several, I would say, because and for rightfully so, because it's not on clinicians' minds that what they're documenting might be able to advance cancer care or improve patient outcomes. There is messiness, there is missingness, there are contradictions in the chart. There's, and I'm guilty of this too, like copy pasting. And so, pull forward information from the last visit I saw the patient. Hopefully that gets updated. But with all the things going on with the, with a visit and all the patients that someone needs to see, that information may just not get updated. And so as a result, you have to kind of solve the puzzle of what's the salient information, what's missing. If something's not there, is it because it's didn't happen and it's the answer is no, or is it unknown? And there's just nuances and things like that at Flatiron, we've been thinking about this for a decade now, how to guide humans through the EHR and pull out these complex details I referenced earlier And we've been able to take a lot of those learnings and build off them over time.
Mhm. And you mentioned one thing earlier, which is de-identification for our audience members who may not know what that means. And it's also there's always a big question that patients have, which is that if my data is being used for research, like how is that? Can they identify me or not? Can you talk a bit about what is de-identification?
I think the simplest way to say is that there's certain types of health information. We'll call it PHI, and those are things that you could, in theory, use to identify a patient. And so that might be, obviously things like social security number people think of, but it's more simple than that. Oftentimes, name, address, things of that nature. And so making sure that those things are removed from the actual data that is being analyzed is critical. But there actually gets to be more complicated than that, even because some of the studies or some of the things that we'll be interested in doing um, can get to really small cohort sizes or for really rare disorders, right? And when you think about it, the smaller the group of patients you're looking at, or the more rare something is, like in theory, the more at risk you might be for being able to re-identify. How many 100-year-olds with, um, sarcoma metastatic to the brain are there? And
And
so
that's in Wyoming, right? Not too many.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yes, yes,
yeah.
great point. And with the geography component as well. And so, on top of the kind of boilerplate, PHI, um, data points that people think of, we also make sure we go through a process where we are having the combinations of different clinical details looked at to ensure that it's not necessarily at risk for re-identification.
Mhm. Right. So let's talk about large language models or the AI. And so, how are you using these large language models to pull the data from this unstructured notes, right, from EHRs and analyzing? Can you talk more about that?
I referenced this earlier, and I really want to hit it home. You, you know, Before answering how we're using large language models, like I really want it to be clear why we want to do this, like why it's important to be able to understand how patients in the real world are being cared for and how they're doing. I used the example earlier of, like, is this patient with lupus that I'm seeing um, going to behave similarly or not to a patient that was on a trial? Take the example of some of the more critical, important data points that can happen in a chart, but, like, taking a step back, actually have a patient experience, like cancer progression, right?
Mhm.
These are serious events that happen. They um, deserve a lot of thought um, in terms of how it's communicated to the patient. Um, you know, how that ends up getting documented in the chart um, is different than how it might be documented in a clinical trial, where everything is so protocolized, everything is measured and written down in detail at every single visit, like the cancer grew this number of centimeters or shrunk this number of centimeters. When I'm documenting in the chart, back to the point about what EHRs are for, um, that's not how it shows up. It shows up as the cancer grew, or the patient did not respond. All of these um, different ways of saying that the cancer progressed. There may be a date that was mentioned. There may be a date that's referenced, like in the past, or I expect it to happen in the future. And so, um, with all this messiness, um, what we at Flatiron have had to learn how to do is to say, okay, this is a critical endpoint progression. We need to know that we can identify these events and um, use them in analyses to answer important questions. So How do we define it? How do we guide a human to go through the chart and find these events so that we feel like we're capturing it accurately? And for a long period of time, just because the technology wasn't there yet, that's what Flatiron would do. We would train human abstractors. We clinicians like myself would write out really detailed policies and procedures to guide a human through a chart to say, if you see something like pseudo progression mentioned, which is something that can happen when immunotherapy is given to a patient and the cancer looks like it's growing, but it's really just inflammation and it didn't actually mean that the cancer was worsening. Like, those sorts of things happen all the time, and you need to have like rules and guidance for how to handle that. And we've come up over the last 10 years with those guidelines for humans, right? To be able to do that well. But and we're really proud of that. We've published on it. We validated our approach for real world progression as an endpoint. But the main limitation of that is it's not scalable, right? Everything I just described is pretty manual. And even though at Flatiron we figured out how to leverage technology to make that as efficient as I think anyone could, there's still the inherent limitation of having a human look through a chart, follow specific rules, and pull out details. And so what LLMs or large language models or any sort of machine learning algorithm that could allow you to extract data allows you to do, hopefully, is maintain that accuracy that you were getting with a human, but scale. So to the point where you may have progression on 500 patients, progression events of 500 patients. Can you get it at 900,000 patients? And so back to your question, like, how do we do it? After answering why we would want to do it, that's been a learning process. It's been an evolution because, as I already mentioned, we used to, and we still do, use humans. We learned a ton about how humans can go about abstracting this. And maybe 6 years ago, we really started exploring natural language processing, deep learning models for extraction, taking advantage of all of that really high quality labeled data that we had by virtue of doing this human abstraction, doing supervised learning to show this data to these models, to be able to evaluate it against this high quality data. And we really learned a lot about what those models could do, what they could do well, how they fit in with humans. We explored something that we called hybrid data curation, where if a deep learning model spit out a confidence threshold or a confidence number for how certain it thinks it is, and it was above a certain threshold, we would say, okay, like, we trust the model, we're going to use that answer. But if it was below that threshold, we'd say, you know what, this is a challenging one for the model. We still need to use a human for it. And the last 2 years have just been incredibly exciting and interesting with large language models, coming into the picture. And I'll say, like, it's not intuitive that what I just described would be a task that lends itself well to a large language model, right? What we are really trying to do is say, is it in the chart? Yes or no? And if so, pull it out while maintaining the initial intent of what was documented, not changing it, not assuming, not predicting. And of course, large language models are, given these words in a row, predicting what the next word would be. So we've had to figure out, okay, how do you take these large language models that are coming out with new versions every couple of months and have these extraordinary capabilities? How do we ensure that it's not predicting whether the patient had cancer, but it's extracting that the patient had cancer? So those are just, I think, some examples of some of the things that we've been able to leverage our past learnings or past experiences and use for large language models today.
And for this large language model to do a good job of doing that, I mean, I always kind of think about, okay, well, it needs to have an MD, it needs to like have a lot of that training or knowledge, and it also needs to have this like the ways of working, like how to work with the chart, how to interpret the information. So, do you use like RAGs and stuff for knowledges, or like prompt engineering, fine tuning? Like, what are the kind of techniques that you use to so that it can do a good job?
I didn't have any computer science or technical background when I joined Flatiron. I have learned so much from working with the data scientists and the machine learning engineers at Flatiron, and um, it is just so amazing to watch kind of the different experiments and techniques and ways that my cross-functional colleagues will go about evaluating different approaches. You mentioned some of them. A couple things that I think I want to emphasize. The first thing related to large language models not necessarily being the intuitive tool you would use. Like they realize, okay, we can't have this spit out more text, which is also unstructured. Like we need this to come out in a JSON format, which we can analyze, right? And so that was something key that may be overlooked that has been important in being able to actually extract the data in a way that is analyzable. We have done all sorts of, I would say, exploring with RAG, with fine tuning, LoRa, related to fine tuning, chain of thought. We've found thus far, and we use, I would say, all of them. But I think the thing that certainly I can wrap my head around the most, and I think where we've had a lot of success, is the prompt engineering and the figuring out how to ask an LLM to do something the way you want it done, or the way you might ask a human to do that. And you heard me referenced earlier how I have helped, our clinicians have helped write these policies and procedures, these guidelines for how a human would go through. We've been able to take those rules and guidelines and use them to prompt the LLM to do it that same way. And in that sense, we have a 10-year kind of head start in thinking about how you can effectively ask an LLM to do these hard things and anticipate what sorts of edge cases you're going to run into. It also really sets up, and we'll talk about maybe evaluation later, but it enables you to evaluate the large language model, who in theory is following a process similar or the same as you've asked a human to do, in a more apples to apples way.
Yeah, yeah. And just for the audience, like who don't know what JSON is, that's the format where you can then have information in a structured way. But going back to the training, do you find easier to train humans or easier to train the LLM?
It's a little bit of both, I would say. It's funny. As an oncologist that went through a lot of training to become an oncologist, think about what that took to train me to do that. I just think it's humorous that when we're prompting the LLM, we'll say, imagine you're an oncologist. I mean, that helps, I would say the LLM better frame the problem that it's trying to do. And that's like a sentence of text, and all of a sudden they have ostensibly the training that I have. And so in that sense, LLMs are really cool and nimble and agile, because you can make changes to the processes, iterate, do error analysis, and go back and change things in a way that's just much easier than certainly working with humans, and certainly working with more traditional supervised learning approaches where you're limited by the labels that you have and that the model's learned from, and it's not easy to change those rules that it's learned. without collecting all new labels. That said, there are still some things that we're finding that LLMs can't do very well, or as well as we would like them to do or need them to do, to do the important research and use cases that we're interested in. Um, I would say one example of that is they're not very good when the answer is not there. I talked about know and unknown earlier, right? And a human, they will do their due diligence of looking through the chart to see, okay, did the patient have progression? Yes or no, or unknown. And if they don't see it, they will reliably say, I didn't find this, right? What we've had issues with and discovered with large language models is they don't like to give that answer. They will, and everyone has heard hallucinate, but I don't think people might realize what that means in the context of what we're talking about in terms of real world evidence and data curation. For the purposes of this, they will confidently say patient had progression on January 1st, 2022. And it sounds confident. It's entirely plausible, but it's not there at all. And so, that's one area that we've had to really think about. How are we in a position to evaluate these large language models accurately, and know when those errors are happening. Another thing that we found challenging, that I think large language models, again, they're improving every month, will eventually get there, but we still have some challenges with are these complicated clinical concepts that might span different pages in the EHR or documents in the EHR, where you need to piece together information to then get the answer. An example of this is like local regional recurrence. So if a patient has breast cancer, an oncologist following that patient, God forbid, hopefully the patient does not progress, but unfortunately, all too often it does. And there's two main ways that could happen. It could travel distantly to another organ. We call that metastasis or distant metastasis, but it also just could come back locally, like in the area that it started, or a local regional recurrence. And both of those are considered advanced disease, but though they're managed differently, they have different implications for the patient and how they'll do. And so it's important to be able to distinguish between those. But to be able to say whether a patient had a local regional recurrence, a couple of things need to happen. One, the clinician who's documenting this needs to actually be aware that specifically saying local regional recurrence might be important or useful. We've talked earlier about why clinicians document, and it's for billing and it's for justifying treatment and making decisions, not for research. And so very frequently, a physician will just say patient recurred, and you just don't know if it was distant. You don't know if it's local. And so there's just some inherent subjectivity there that's challenging to begin with, that we found humans are able to kind of handle that ambiguity better than LLMs. But also, it requires you to sometimes piece together, as I mentioned earlier, the information across different documents. And so a radiology report may say the patient had recurrence to the chest wall, right? And then a couple of documents later, the clinician who's interpreting this radiology report might say that the patient did recur, and piecing that it was the chest wall together with the fact that it came back equals local regional recurrence. That's something a clinician would think when they read it, but that's hard to do or teach an LLM to do that.
Yeah. And that's a great point, right? That you have these different pieces that which may be in different areas, and it needs to have that kind of sense to put that together, which, I'm not sure like to what extent they can do very well at this point, right? Like the current language models at this in 2025.
Yeah, but I'm optimistic. I think that as data becomes more longitudinal, as it becomes more important to piece together information across documents and over time as novel AI methods make it more possible and feasible than before to combine clinical data with other sorts of data points. I do think we're going to be able to answer questions that we haven't been able to before by piecing information together over time.
So let's talk about that. You mentioned about the why, right? So why we want to get this information. So by being able to extract this information, what kind of answers have you been able to get? How has that been helping, let's say, in clinical practice so far?
I would say the main one that stands out, and it's the one that I referenced earlier, is you have these clinical trials that have shown what progression-free survival looks like for patients. And that is one of the main endpoints in clinical trials that's used because it correlates with overall survival, and it happens more frequently than death events. And so it's easier to measure that outcome than it is overall survival. But there's no guarantee when you do a trial that the progression-free survival that's been measured for that cohort generalizes, again, to the patient that I'm seeing in front of me, right? And so there's a lot of interest in understanding, okay, what is actually the progression-free survival of patients in the real world? And then, that was some of the main motivation between recent research that we did and presented at AACR AI. We wanted to see how well large language models could do at extracting progression events and their dates. We wanted to do that specifically to see how well they could do compared to how well a human could do it. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Usually when you, as you know, evaluate an algorithm, you evaluate it against some reference data, right? And often in real world evidence and other fields, like what you're evaluating against is human label data, right? But that becomes problematic when the reference data, the human label data that you may be evaluating against isn't 100% correct, right? And so why might it not be 100% correct? Well, as we've discussed earlier, real world data is super messy. Like there's subjectivity. There's tasks that are just hard. I told you about local regional recurrence. And so even really highly trained human abstractors that, we pride ourselves on who we hire and how we train them and how we evaluate them still make mistakes. Like we should acknowledge that humans aren't perfect, right? And when you evaluate a model against that test data that is imperfect, it limits your ability to understand how well the model, or in this case, the large language model, actually did. The analogy I usually use, because everyone can relate to it, is imagine you took a test, you studied a really long time, and you get the results back, and you got a 75%, and you're disappointed. You thought you should have gone higher. And then it's revealed later that the answer key had errors. And that's super frustrating because now you don't know how well you actually did. There could have been answers where you were right and the answer key was wrong, but it was you that was penalized. And so that same thing happens when evaluating models, and in this case, large language models. And so a couple things. The higher the quality of the reference data you can get, the more accurate you're going to be able to really understand how well the large language models work. But also, and what we did in this study, if you're able to contextualize how difficult that task is for a human by comparing the LLM to reference data and a human to separate reference data, then you're more on equal footing, right? There may still be mistakes in the reference data, but you're not evaluating the LLM on only one human and being done with it. You're saying, okay, there's a human approach, there's an LLM approach. We're going to evaluate them on the same data. And in that sense, you can see how similar or not their performance is. You can generate regular metrics like recall or precision or F1 score. And so in this study, what we did is we taught an LLM to extract progression events and dates across 14 different cancer types. And we actually compared how the LLM did on those tasks to extract progression to an expert human. And we measured the results and we contextualized the results by saying the LLM was within 4 F1 points of a human. And I think that that's just a more intuitive, easier way to understand the quality of a model than traditional metrics. I could tell you that the precision or recall is 75% for the model. You won't know anything about the reference data and you don't know what to make of it. And in my experience, people love it when they hear that numbers are in the 90s. Like, that sounds great. We're good, right? They know what sounds bad, which is tended to be, 50s or 60s, metrics in the 50s or 60s. But they don't really know what to make or how to think about something in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I don't blame them. I often don't either, because it's only a piece of the picture. And so what we really wanted to do was show that we could do this well, that we could do this for a hard and important problem that varies by cancer type, because how progression happens and how it's documented, how frequently it happens, all things that can impact performance, changes based on the cancer type. And so we wanted to show that we could do this across a multitude of different cancer types, that we could do it close to how well an expert human could do it. And, transparently, we also wanted to see where we weren't doing it as well, so that we could understand and dig into that. And in this study, we saw that, almost across the board, our results were very, very close to that of a human. And there was a couple of exceptions where the difference between how well the LLM was doing and a human was doing was larger than we would like. And we were able to say, okay, that's a signal that we can do something better here, right? There's something different about this cancer or these scenarios that we need to understand. And so, working as a cross-functional team at Flatiron, which we almost always do, we did error analysis, and we discovered that for, let's say, hepatocellular carcinoma, which was one of the cancers where we were struggling more, we saw that the large language model was struggling to discern or differentiate between whether the patient was developing advanced disease and that was it, or whether the patient already had advanced disease and then was experiencing a progression event. And basically whether to lump that progression event in with the initial diagnosis or if it was distinct. And humans were able to do that and had, I would say, a better idea of being able to classify that than the large language models. And as a result, we were able to go back and prompt it differently. Like, if you're in this scenario, if it's been X number of months, consider it part of the initial diagnosis. If it's been more than X number of months, consider it a distinct progression event. And when we did that, we saw the gap close and the performance improve.
Okay. And in terms of progression-free survival, right? We always think about we have the progression-free survival numbers for clinical trials, but in real world, we always think, well, it's probably 10 to 15% less. Like, what did you find actually by doing all of this that you published?
In this study, we evaluated real-world progression-free survival. This is an endpoint. I referenced the work we've done on endpoints with human abstraction and publications earlier, which we're very proud of. We wanted to do an analysis that would actually reflect how this LLM extracted data would actually be used, right? Because it's one thing to say, like, the metrics are this, but metrics only tell you a part of the story, and they change depending on what you're evaluating on. And what you really want to know is like, okay, when you use this data instead of human abstracted data, do you get the same answer or not? Like, can you trust the answer? And so what we did is we performed analyses where we looked at what the real world progression-free survival was across these 14 different cancer types if you used human abstracted data. And then we did it again, except subbing in the LLM extracted data. And the results we saw were like almost identical, which was very cool to see. And that's, I think, another example of where metrics don't tell the whole story, because you can have metrics that look great, but not necessarily lead when you're using them in combination, these models and these variables, to the right answer. Or you can have metrics that don't look as good, but when you're using them in combination with each other, the things you made mistakes on tend to fall out of the cohort of interest sometimes, and their results may actually still be okay. And so I know you were asking specifically about like, how did the real world progression results compare to the trial? And what I answered was, how do the real world progression events of human abstracted data compared to large language model data? That was really the focus of the study we were looking at. That said, and it varies based on the study that you're looking at and the trial and the cohort. I think it's your intuition is correct that real world PFS does tend to be a bit less, just because of the differences between a trial and the patients in a trial and real world.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the really nice care that you get in a clinical trial versus in real world, and the follow-ups and everything, right? That's definitely makes a difference. Yeah, but it's great because we always think about that intuitively, but you're able to see using the data and using, I know the humans did the work to compare as well, but now this gives us an ability to, with the LLMs, to be able to do that in the future in a pretty fast way, with that, which definitely is going to be helpful when we are thinking about how when we're developing drugs, especially. That's very helpful for pharmaceutical companies. So
Absolutely.
yeah, so what are kind of like the things you mentioned? Sometimes the AI did better, sometimes not. Like, what are, like, as we're going into the future, like, what are some of the things that you see the opportunities to improve for the LLM so they can even do a better job than what has been able to do so far?
I think there's ways to answer that from the, researcher, data scientist perspective, and there's ways to answer that from the clinician perspective. And so, maybe I'll try to answer both, with different hats on. I think that from the data science research perspective, validation is so important. These large language models are incredible in what they can do. And they're improving. It's a moving target, right? Like you think they can't do something, and then you turn around and they can do it, right? And it, as a result, it's really easy to take what they say as being correct, right? But the examples I shared earlier in the conversation, where they don't like to be wrong, or they don't like things to be missing, and they'll make something up. The only way you'll know that's happening is if you have an approach for evaluating them. If you have labeled data to evaluate on, if you're lucky enough, like Flatiron, if you have the source documentation to go back and see, okay, the large language model said this, is it there in the chart or not? Yes or no? I think that's an area where I really hope, and we're committed to this at Flatiron, that our ability and effort for evaluating these models keeps pace with the increasing abilities and capabilities of the large language models, because I think that's going to be critical. Related to that, more from the clinician's perspective, the way that I feel this the most, and it's not necessarily a problem with the large language models, but it's a problem with the system that is being impacted by the availability of the large language models. Um, Patients have instant access to their data and their results now, which has definite pros and cons to it. And there's definitely been, even before large language models, situations where a patient of mine will access their imaging results and see that their cancer has worsened, and have to kind of experience that alone or without their oncologist's guidance, or ability to contextualize what those results mean. And that's very scary and just not an ideal situation in my mind. What's changed is now patients can, in that same situation, are putting those results into, say, ChatGPT or another, LLM, and saying, what does this mean? And they're getting interpretations and results of those findings, again, without involving the doctor or the oncologist, the clinician. And to be clear, like there's definite pros to ensuring that patients have access to their information, are knowledgeable, that they can go into their visits prepared, so it's not just like overwhelming, and they're educated, right? But I think there's a difference between that and kind of removing the human doctor-patient relationship component to, what I think are some of the most important and meaningful and toughest conversations that you have, right? And I'm increasingly in this situation where I know the patient. I know how a patient would, I think, ideally like this information communicated. I know what it means in the big picture, and that opportunity to take all those things into account and deliver the information in what I think is the most empathetic way possible is kind of been taken away because they've already kind of had this conversation with an LLM. And so, again, acknowledging that there's a lot of good that's going to come out of that, like I think there's opportunities to really think about how this expanded access to interpreting health data, to say nothing of the PHI concerns, that come along with this, how we can do a better job with that.
Okay. And one of the things I keep saying is that, see, technology is just not enough. There needs to be a lot of domain knowledge that needs to go into this LLM for it to do a good job, and a lot of iterative training that needs to go in so that it can do a good job. So can you talk a bit about that? Like, how much domain knowledge did you have to feed, as well as how many iterations of training did you have to do for this?
Having a cross-functional team, I think, is essential. It's my favorite thing about working at Flatiron by far. Is like, I already told you how much that I feel like I've learned working with these individuals across these domains, right? It's critical, and I'm biased, but it's critical that data scientists who are being asked to use these amazing new methods know what it is that they're actually trying to solve and why that matters, especially in healthcare. Like, what is the actual end result this is going to have on a patient, or why is this actually clinically meaningful? And if you don't have that clinical piece, I think it's very difficult to build something that is going to work. And even if it works, that's going to work within the workflow that it might be intended for. So yeah, I know. So that's just one thing I wanted to say. In terms of um, how we go about ensuring that a large language model can do um, the job we want it to do. How do we
Yep.
train it? Where does it get its domain knowledge? Um, that's a moving target. When we first started experimenting with large language models, we wrote um, a manuscript that basically said zero shot data extraction using large language models does not work. Like you
Right.
need to use fine tuning, LoRa, to get meaningful results to extract. In this case, it was PD-L1 results as a biomarker related to immunotherapy. Um, that paper, I'm glad we did it. It showed thought leadership. It was a moment in time, but the world has moved on. That is no longer reflective of what large language models can do, right? And we are seeing now that um, there's a lot you can accomplish if you prompt it with the right clinical guidance, with the right um, way to think about where in the chart to focus. You don't want to put too much context in front of the large language model because it will overwhelm it. It will increases the chance of it being of hallucinating.
Mm.
You don't want to put too little in front of it. It doesn't have the information it needs to answer the question. Um, and so, we will frequently work as a team to say, okay, what words are likely to be around the thing that we're trying to find, right?
Mhm.
What types of notes um, are the types of notes where the information we're looking for are we likely to find? Um, how has what we're trying to find changed over time in terms of standard of care to the point where maybe we should limit the time period that we're looking for?
Yeah.
Um,
Interesting.
you know, um, for example, if you really want to understand PD-L1 results related to immunotherapy,
Mhm.
you shouldn't ask the LLM to look for those results before it was standard of care. Like
Yeah.
all you're
Before like
doing is
2015.
increasing
Yeah.
the chances of it making a mistake, right? And so
Yeah. Yeah.
you want to really focus to the extent you can the large language model on the salient information. It increases the precision of the model. So,
Yeah.
um, I think those are all, I would say, examples of the importance of domain knowledge and cross-functional work.
Absolutely. That's great. And final question for you. So, as we continue the journey in this and using the LLMs to extract better and better data, what do you see to be the area of like the biggest impact?
We've talked a lot about using large language models for data curation. And I think that it's important to understand that because ultimately I view that as the foundational step for a lot of the other, um, what I would say, promising tools and applications of AI that you may hear about are. So, for example, predictive modeling. You want to predict if a patient is going to respond to this treatment or not, or predict if the patient is going to progress on this treatment or not. Well, to train any sort of model or evaluate it, you need a lot of progression data, right? And we just talked about how having an LLM to curate progression events across the EHR can get you that. Like that's where you start. Now you have progression data that you can put and train in a model to do. Same with clinical decision support. If I'm having a tool pop up saying that the patient may not have been tested for a biomarker that they should have been, well, how do we know that? We need to have gone through the chart and
Hmm.
accurately looked for whether the biomarker was perf- um, tested for or not.
Yeah.
And I already told you sometimes it's challenging if it's not there to reliably
Make
have
it
the
up.
LLM
Yeah.
say
Yeah.
it's not there. But if you do that well, if you do the data curation piece well, you start to unlock all of these other downstream applications that are going to actually impact care at the point of care and help patients.
Mhm. That's great, and we're looking forward to that, right? And to be able to serve the patients the best, as best as we can. Dr. Aaron Cohen, head of research oncology clinical data for Flatiron Health. Aaron, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Amar, there were a lot of great insights Aaron offered. What did you think?
Yeah, it was great to talk about this study that they did, and definitely a specific application of large language models that went deep into the domain, the clinical domain, right? And success that came out of that. So that was very good to hear, because a lot of times we're hearing about the ChatGPT and like a lot of the others coming up with the new versions, but these are more generic models. I always love it when we're talking about a specific model for life sciences that has been successful, and it's actually showing results that are, he said, as comparable as for with human beings, right? So, and it's a tough problem to solve. So happy you see a lot of the progress that was made there.
So one of the things Aaron talked about when LLMs go through a medical record versus humans is that LLMs aren't good at identifying when information is missing. Aaron said humans will say the data is not in the chart. LLMs don't like to do that. And I thought that was a great insight. It would seem to be a fixable problem, but how difficult is that to address?
Like the hallucination that you talked about, right? That when the information is not there, LLM will just make it up. I believe that as we move forward with that, and especially as we bring multi-agentic systems where one agent is producing information and another agent is checking whether that information is there, I think those will be some of the areas where we can improve on this. And it's a it it's a well-known problem. We're trying to, I mean, a lot of people are trying to fix that problem. Hopefully, there will be a lot of advances in fixing hallucination over the next year or so. But I also thought that something like this, right, in this clinical setting, for an LLM to make something up is it can be a bit dangerous, and you have to be very careful that that's not if the human is then using that information, that they're not taking it literally, right? And then prescribing something that is wrong for the patient. So we have to be very careful about it. And the fact that they were using a lot of domain knowledge, a lot of the training to try to minimize that. I think that's a great way to do that.
So the two of you discussed a Flatiron study to use AI to extract real world progression-free survival and compared how well AI model did it to how humans did it. For the most part, there was a pretty good match in the ability of AI to do what humans do. What did you make of that study? How impressive are those results? And what do you think the implications are for clinical applications?
That was pretty impressive that AI is able to do what the humans are able to do after a lot of manual curation. I think one of the important implications of that is going to be that for, let's say, for this specific area, progression-free survival, now as new data keeps coming, instead of having more humans cure more manually this data, which is very labor intensive, it is very expensive. If they're able to use this AI to be able to analyze the new records and update the, let's say, the data and then the conclusions, then we're able to get these kind of results. I mean, pretty much instantaneously, rather than waiting for, or like, the also like paying so much for the humans to do that manual. So I would say as they develop these kind of algorithms, and if AI is doing as good or even better than humans, the AI should be able to provide a lot of those results to us very quickly. That's going to just help in general. Like, I mean, progression-free survival, understanding that, understanding the unmet medical need in the different cancers, and based on the different types of therapies, like immunotherapies. That's a very important question of in of course in clinical practice, but also for drug manufacturers, because then they understand where is it that we need to continue to develop drugs. So yeah, having these kind of answers being made available at a pretty good rate, pretty good frequency would be very helpful.
You asked about the need for domain knowledge, and Aaron talked about the benefits of having cross-functional teams. And he said it's critical data scientists know what it is they're trying to solve, and why it matters, what the end result is, and why it's clinically meaningful. And he talked about this being a moving target. Do you agree? Is this a moving target?
First of all, the data science trying to understand what is actually happening and the domain is extremely important. I mean, I'm trained myself in biochemistry and as well as in machine learning, right? So so when I'm thinking about solving a problem using machine learning, because I have the domain knowledge, it's just much easier to really frame the problem, solve the problem. Whereas when you don't have that, and you have like the technical people who have the machine learning knowledge, but not necessarily domain knowledge, they really, I mean, they may not understand the nuances. They may not be able to think creatively about solving the problem, or the different angles in which they can create the solutions. Because I mean, creating a new solution, that is a very you need to use your brain a lot. You need to think about a lot of different aspects, right? So that's something that you can do well only if you have the domain knowledge. So definitely that's the thing. A moving target in the sense that we have, I mean, he discussed, right? We have new models coming in every week, every month, and they have more information, more data that they're trained on, right? So they, as researchers are working with these new LLMs, they have to think about, okay, well, what is it that the LLM is able to do now by default versus what is it that we need to train it on, right? So that's why it's going to be a moving target for a while, as long as new information comes in. Now, hopefully, the new LLMs that are coming in are better and better, so that the domain-specific training hopefully will be less and less as time goes on. But let's see how we progress with the LLMs. There's also now small language models, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to continue to see what comes out that we use, and how much training and what type of training do we continue to give to those new models.
Well, it was a great conversation, and Amar, thanks as always.
Thanks, Danny.
Thanks again to our sponsor, Agilisium Labs. Life Sciences DNA is a bi-monthly podcast produced by the Levine Media Group, with production support from Fullview Media. Be sure to follow us on your preferred podcast platform. Music for this podcast is provided courtesy of the Jonah Levine Collective. We'd love to hear from you. Pop us a note at danny@levinemediagroup.com. For Life Sciences DNA, I'm Daniel Levine. Thanks for joining us.